What made you stop trusting professionals with your child? When my son's therapist told me he was making excellent progress and I found the progress notes still sealed in the same folder from 8 weeks ago. My son Emmett is 9. He has been in therapy since he was 7 because his father died in front of him. Not suddenly, slowly. Over 11 months of treatment that did not work, and a hospital room where Emmett sat in a vinyl chair every Tuesday after school and watched his father become less of his father, one machine at a time. When Emmett started having nightmares, I called our pediatrician Melody. She referred us to a child psychologist named Dr. Linden. Credentials on the wall, 14 years of practice. A waiting room full of fidget toys and a receptionist who called every child sweetheart, in a voice calibrated to sound like safety. I trusted Dr. Linden because the pediatrician trusted Dr. Linden, and because trust travels through referrals the way current travels through wire, and I was too tired and too scared and too deep inside my own grief to verify the circuit. Emmett saw Dr. Linden every Tuesday at 4 p.m. 45-minute sessions. I sat in the waiting room. He went inside. The door closed. After each session, Dr. Linden came out and said, "He did great today." She said, "We're making progress." She said, "He's opening up." Great. Progress. Opening up. Professional words arranged in professional order to produce the professional impression that something professional was happening behind a door I was not allowed to see through. I believed her for 8 months. Then Emmett came out of a session with his backpack unzipped. A folder was sticking out. Blue. Labeled Emmett. Session notes. The next morning I opened it because a mother who has been told progress 43 times without a single specific example is a mother who eventually opens the folder. Inside were cognitive behavioral therapy worksheets for children. Feelings charts, emotion scales, sentence completion exercises. When I feel sad, the thing that scares me most is, I wish my dad could. 15 worksheets spanning 8 months. Every single one was blank, not incomplete, blank, untouched. The creases were sharp. The pages were crisp. These worksheets had never been placed in front of my son. I filed a formal records request. The records arrived 2 weeks later. Emmett's file contained intake notes from session 1, a brief assessment, and then 43 session entries that said, almost identically, patient engaged in therapeutic conversation, affect appropriate, continued monitoring recommended. The same 3 sentences, 43 times, for 8 months. No specific observations, no treatment milestones, no evidence that anything happened in those sessions beyond a child sitting in a room and an adult billing for the time. I pulled Emmett out the next day. I found a new therapist, Dr. Nazari. On the 3rd session, she called me in. She said, "Emmett has not been in active therapy. The grief processing he should have started 8 months ago hasn't started. He is exactly where he was when he walked through Dr. Linden's door the first time." She said, "He has developed a coping mechanism that concerns me. He told me that during his sessions with Dr. Linden, he would sit and wait. He said Dr. Linden gave him an iPad and let him play games while she worked on her computer. He said this happened every session. He said she told him, 'We'll talk when you're ready,' and he was never ready, and she never pushed, and the iPad was always available, and the 45 minutes passed, and she came out and said progress, and he went home and the nightmares continued. An iPad. My son sat in a therapist's office for 8 months playing games on an iPad, while I sat in the waiting room believing the word progress, because a woman with credentials said it 43 times, and I was too grief-stricken to ask what it looked like." Dr. Nazari said, "This is not uncommon. Some practitioners maintain caseloads beyond their capacity and default to passive session management. The child is present. The billing is valid. The notes are vague enough to satisfy a records audit, but no therapeutic work is performed." She said, "Emmett is not damaged by this. He is delayed. But I want you to understand that 8 months of his grief window were used by a professional who took your money and gave your son a screen. 43 sessions, $140 each, $6,020 total, $6,000 for an iPad, and 3 sentences repeated 43 times. But Emmett told Dr. Nazari something during their 4th session that she shared with me, with his permission, because he wanted me to know. He said, 'I was ready to talk to Dr. Linden. On the 3rd visit, I was going to tell her about the hospital, about the machines, about the sound the heart monitor made when it stopped. I was sitting on the couch and I was going to say it, but she handed me the iPad and said, "Let's start easy today." And every visit after that, she handed me the iPad first. And I thought, starting easy meant we'd get to the hard part later. We never got to the hard part. I just kept waiting for her to ask. She never asked. He was 7. He was ready. He was sitting on a couch prepared to describe the sound of his father's heart monitor flatting, and the professional in the room handed him a screen and called it starting easy. And my son waited for 8 months for a question that never came, because asking the question would have required doing the work, and the work was not happening, and the iPad was easier, and the billing went through regardless. I filed a complaint with the state licensing board. What I got back was a form letter. Case number assigned. Review process, 6 to 12 months. Dr. Linden would be notified and given the opportunity to respond. Dr. Linden would be notified. She now knew my name was on a complaint. 4 days later, Melody called. Her voice was tight. She said, "Dr. Linden called me. She said you pulled Emmett out suddenly and she's concerned about the disruption to his care. She asked me to talk to you." Dr. Linden had called the pediatrician who referred us and framed the whole thing like I was the problem, like I was the one disrupting my son's care. She was not sitting back waiting for the process. She was already moving. She was telling her version before I could tell mine. I told Melody everything. The blank worksheets, the identical notes, the iPad, what Dr. Nazari said, the billing. Melody went quiet. Then she said, "I've referred 11 families to her over the past 3 years. She said she would contact the other families. I asked if she would support my complaint. She said, 'I believe you. But if I go on record against another provider based on one parent's account, that has consequences for me. Let me talk to the other families first.' That night, my friend Narissa said, 'She's not defending herself. She's building a story. You need to get ahead of this. Your version needs dates and evidence, not just emotion.' I built a timeline. Every session date, every payment, every time Dr. Linden said progress. I got to session 3, October 14th, the session where Emmett was ready. 238 days between the moment my son was ready to talk about his father dying and the moment I found the blank worksheets and pulled him out. Then Dr. Linden's receptionist Amelia called from what sounded like somewhere she did not want to be heard. She said, 'You're not the first parent to pull their kid out. You're just the first one to file anything.' She said 3 families had left in the last year. 2 told her on the way out that their kid said nothing was happening. She told Dr. Linden. Dr. Linden said children project avoidance onto the therapeutic process, and the parents were enabling it. Amelia said, I schedule 32 kids a week through that office. I don't know how many of them are sitting with an iPad, but I know your son wasn't the only one. I asked if she would put it in writing. She said, I can't lose this job, but if the board calls me, I won't lie. 3 weeks passed. Emmett was seeing Dr. Nazari twice a week. He slept through the night on a Wednesday, then again on a Friday. 2 full nights without calling out. That had not happened since before Caden died. He came home from school with a drawing, a house with 4 windows and a yellow sun. He said, that's our house when Dad was still here. The new doctor said I could draw the before stuff if I wanted to. The before stuff. Someone had given him permission to remember his life before the hospital. I put it on the fridge. Then Dr. Linden's formal response arrived from the licensing board. 7 pages. She stated she had employed a child-directed, low-pressure therapeutic model. The iPad was a self-regulation tool consistent with trauma-informed practice. The blank worksheets were intentionally left incomplete to avoid re-traumatization. Then this. I exhibited signs of vicarious trauma and projected urgency onto the therapeutic timeline, which the respondent managed by maintaining a stable and non-confrontational environment for the patient. Vicarious trauma, projected urgency. She was using my grief, my husband's death, the worst year of my life, as evidence that my judgment could not be trusted. She was telling the licensing board that the reason I thought my son was not getting help was because I was too broken to understand what help looked like. Narissa read all 7 pages. She said, she's saying you were too messed up to know what good therapy looked like. One parent's word against a 14-year practitioner is not enough. You need Melody. You need Amelia. You need the new therapist's evaluation. Melody had contacted 2 other families she referred. One said good experience. The other told a story identical to Emmett's. iPad every session. No real talking. But that family did not want to get involved. The mother said, we just moved on. Then Melody said, I'll write a letter. I'll say I made the referral. I've heard from multiple families with similar concerns, and I believe the board should investigate fully. I can't say malpractice, but I can say the pattern is enough to warrant a real look. One parent is a complaint. A pattern is an investigation. I built the rebuttal. The blank worksheets with session dates. The 43 identical entries. The billing statements totaling $6,020 for services never performed. Dr. Nazari's written evaluation stating Emmett had received no active intervention. Melody's letter with the word pattern. My own statement kept plain. My son was ready to talk about his father's death during his 3rd session. He waited 8 months for his therapist to ask. She never asked. Then Dr. Linden left a voicemail from a personal cell number. She said, I think we should talk, mother to professional. Before this goes any further, there are things about your son's case that a licensing board won't understand the way 2 people in a room together would. She wanted a private conversation. No recording, no board, no paper trail. Whatever happened would become her word against mine. I did not call back. I forwarded the voicemail to the board's case manager, a professional who wrote 7 pages about doing nothing wrong, does not call a parent from her personal phone at 8 o'clock at night unless something about those 7 pages is not sitting right, even with her. Emmett walked into the kitchen one evening and saw the blue folder. He recognized it. He said, are you trying to get her in trouble? I said, I'm trying to make sure what happened to you doesn't happen to another kid. He said, I used to think it was my fault, that I wasn't talking because I wasn't brave enough. The new doctor told me it wasn't my job to make the therapist ask. It was her job to ask. But I still feel like I should have just said it, even without her asking. I said, you were 7. You walked into a room ready to talk about the worst thing that ever happened to you, and an adult whose only job was to listen handed you a screen instead. That is not your fault. That will never be your fault. He said, will you tell me if she gets in trouble? I want to know. The board interview was on a Tuesday. A plain conference room, 2 investigators, a recording device. I presented the timeline, the documents, the evidence, dates, facts, no crying, no yelling. One investigator asked, did you ever request to observe a session or receive a detailed update? I said, no, I trusted her. She told me he was getting better. I believed her because I needed him to be getting better. I was grieving too. I didn't have the energy to question the one person who was supposed to be helping my son. That was my mistake, but it doesn't change what she did with the time I gave her. Then the investigator said, we've already reviewed Dr. Linden's response, and we've begun contacting other families. She said, your son's file was not the only one with identical session notes. I asked how many. She said, I can't disclose that at this stage. But the way she said it, the pause before the sentence, the way her eyes dropped to the table, told me everything the words did not. It was not a small number. 2 weeks later, the letter arrived. Dr. Linden's license had been placed under supervised probation. She was required to submit to a full practice audit. She was prohibited from seeing new patients. The board cited pattern deficiencies in clinical documentation, treatment implementation, and patient care standards. That evening, I sat with Emmett on the back porch. The sun was going down. I told him what I had promised I would tell him. I said Dr. Linden was being investigated. She could not see new patients. He said, other kids too? I said, it looks like it. He said, I'm glad you opened the folder, Mom. I said, I'm sorry I didn't open it sooner. He said, you opened it. That's the part that matters. The week before, Emmett had his session with Dr. Nazari. He talked about the hospital. He described the room, the machines, the sound the heart monitor made. He used the word flatline. He said he learned it from a nurse who did not know he was listening. Then he said something he asked Dr. Nazari to tell me. He said, my mom sat in every waiting room. Dr. Linden's in this one. She always sits and waits for me. I want her to know I'm not just waiting anymore. I held it together in that office. I walked to the car. I got Emmett buckled in. He said, can we get pizza? I said, sure. I closed the driver's door and put my hands on the steering wheel, and I completely fell apart. My son had walked into a room and described the sound of his father dying. He said flatline because he heard it from a nurse 2 years ago and carried it ever since. And then he said he was not just waiting anymore. He said it through his therapist because that was the safe channel. He was 9 years old and he was telling his mother the waiting was over. Emmett kept going twice a week. The nightmares became less frequent. He started talking about Caden in ways that were not just about the hospital. He told me about the birthday when Caden tried to make pancakes and burned them so bad the smoke alarm went off. He told me about the time Caden let him steer the shopping cart and he crashed it into a display of cereal, and they both laughed so hard they could not breathe. I started hearing my husband husband's name in my house again, spoken by our son, and it sounded less like a wound and more like a person who existed and mattered and was allowed to be remembered out loud. The folder is open, the silence is broken, and my son is no longer waiting for someone to ask. He is answering.